So I work mostly in animation and immersive media, and I also do some live action stuff. And I'm just interested in like mixing different mediums and experimenting in that way. And I started Auto, I guess, almost 7 years ago. I was living in Indonesia, and I had quit my job as an executive producer for a film production company there. And I decided that I really wanted to focus on creating my own content and making my own stuff. So I took a year and I did an artist residency with a puppet theater company. So I learned how to make puppets, and I experimented with like making my own sort of like art films and video art. And then I decided to start Auto. So I started by making some live action, some documentary works, and some animation works as well. And during that period, like the technology was advancing in terms of like virtual reality and other forms of immersive media. And so I decided to focus into that. And I started working on a series that was based on oral histories that I had collected when I lived in Egypt during the revolution, focusing on like queer voices from the revolution. It's queer in a time of forced migration. And the first part is called Half a Life, which is a film. The second part is a virtual reality experience, which is called Another Dream. And the final part is called They Call Me Asylum Seeker, and that's an interactive web experience. So this project started like almost 11 years ago now. And in my past life, I was an economist, and I focused on doing like economic research, mostly in the Middle East. And I was always very interested in oral histories and collecting data that way. And when the revolution happened, it was at that time I had lived in the Middle East for a significant part of my life, and I was seeing how people were more open to talking about politics than they had ever been before. So a journalist friend and I decided to travel around the country, and we decided to focus on interviewing like the voices that you weren't really hearing in the news coverage. So this was like ethnic and religious minorities, like LGBT people, and like women, and different sort of like people. And we traveled around, and we collected like over 60 interviews from different parts of Egypt. But like a lot of the stories that kind of really stuck to me were the ones from like a lot of the queer activists that we met. And I noticed that there was like a growing LGBT rights movement in the Middle East. And as time progressed, I saw that a lot of my friends had to kind of start leaving home and seeking asylum elsewhere. And these were people who were very committed to making their countries like a better place, and had never expressed any sort of interest in leaving. So seeing that change, and then also seeing the narrative that I was seeing around the world about the refugee crisis and what that meant, I felt like the stories of the people that I knew that were being impacted by this weren't being included in that. So I decided that I really needed to like focus on highlighting those stories. And we had so many interviews and so much content, because I followed these individuals it focuses on for like almost a span of 10 years, that it didn't feel right to just like kind of trim it down to fit it into one piece. So I decided to kind of break it down and make 3 different pieces that focus on different aspects of their journey. So the first part is more of like questioning like what would make you want to leave your home, and that's something that I don't think many of us, at least like here in the Netherlands, for example, or in other parts of Europe or in the US, have to think about often, which is why like I'm gonna leave my home, or like what really that means. And then the second part focuses more on what happens after you leave your home, and can you really make a new place a home, and what does that really mean? And kind of exploring what it means like for the women in the center of the second piece, which is Another Dream, like them coming here, escaping maybe some aspect of homophobia from the government or society, but then facing other forms of discrimination here with racism and like Islamophobia, for example, and how that impacts people. And then the final series, which I completed this last year in 2020, kind of brings in another character who's a Sudanese artist, who's the first person to come out as gay on the internet from Sudan, and he got asylum in Norway, and it kind of, he's been gone for a while, and it loops in his story of going home for the first time after the recent uprising in Sudan. So it kind of explores like that feeling of like what are the things that you miss, and this like feeling of like wanting to go back if that ever really is a possibility. Yeah, for me, representation is super important, because I feel like not representing people who are often marginalized is almost like contributing to the erasure of marginalized people like myself. And I think that if I want to see something, or I want to see myself in the story or part of my world represented in the stories I see or in the media that I consume. So I think that it's kind of common sense that if we exist in the world, why can't we exist in the stories that are being shared or in the work that is being played, like exhibited, etc. I mean, I think that animation is super powerful in a way that it can really transport you and communicate feelings differently, where the suspension of disbelief is kind of extended, where people know that that it's not real. So especially when discussing or sharing like tough issues like in this series, it kind of softens people or opens them up to really listening to what the words are, and the visuals can be used to represent more of like the internal emotions of people, where you don't have to like really recreate reality so much with animation, I feel, or at least in the style of animation that I like to do. And I think that for me, especially in technology, and this kind of connects, I think, to representation, where there's so few people of color who are involved in this sort of like in the world of tech in general. And I think that it's good to have these like communities of color like also engage with the content and see themselves represented in stories that are being shared. And I think if this is the future of storytelling, I definitely want our stories to be part of that future. So it's really important for me to not only have it be involved in the content, but also in the making of it as well. And it's the stories that I'm kind of drawn to as well. And I'm a nerd and I like technology and stuff. I grew up like moving around between a lot of places. Like I spent my childhood in Latin America, where my mother's family is from. I was born in the States, moved to Latin America, then I lived in the Middle East. I lived in Asia, and then now I live here. So I think I've always looked at the world as home in a way, and I think it wasn't until this year that I realized like how like now I feel like I can't move, and before I felt like I could easily go see my family and stuff like this, and it kind of hit home even more that some of my friends and the people whose stories I focus on like don't have the privilege of being able to take a flight to just go see their family. And I think that kind of changed the definition of what home is to me. I think that safety and feeling safe is like something that's key to being home. A place where you feel like you can be yourself is probably how I would define being home. I feel like I can only speak of my experience as being a person of color and having lived here, and I've noticed that here, for example, being somebody who's from the US or predominantly from, like I mostly, actually not at this point, I haven't lived most of my life in the US, but anyways, I was born in the US. And in the US, like if you're born there, you're from there. And I noticed that living here in the rhetoric, like I would have, for example, Dutch friends, and I would have another Dutch friend ask me like, oh, who's coming or where are they from? And then the friend would show up, and if they were a person of color, they would be like, oh, you didn't say they were like from Suriname or they're from Indonesia. And I was like, well, to me, they're Dutch, like, and the same way that a white Dutch friend would be. But it was interesting to see how nationality wasn't connected to a passport, but it was being connected to a skin color and a sort of national identity. And I understand that the history of places is different. But if we're living in an increasingly like multicultural world, like I think it's something that we need to kind of evaluate and question and think about really, is like how are we really trying to be more inclusive of one another, and what are these identities? I don't think I know the answer, but it was just something that to me like raise certain questions, where it's like if you say that you're from somewhere and you've lived there and you feel like this place is your home, but then you're being told that because of the color of your skin or the color of the skin of your parents, you're somehow less from that place. Like, what kind of message is that? And I don't know the answer, but I think that that's something that I'm constantly exploring in my work. And I think that, like, personally, like, I come from a mixed background where my mother's family is from Latin America, my father's family is from West Africa, and I was born in the US. And kind of feeling always like in between places, I think, is something that I've felt growing up and throughout my life, and feeling like if you don't look a certain way, then a certain aspect of your identity can be denied. And what does that mean? Who gets to claim where you fit in? What is home? Who you are? And those are the things that I think kind of drive my work, and maybe it's a part of exploring a side of myself or my sense of self and place.